welcome to Gospel Jazz. We're doing some marathon sessions here today. We just all know we got a couple weeks here. We're all kind of busy, so we're trying to find a day here and just jam some stuff out. We got all of our wonderful ideas for the rest of the season up on the wall. So let's get it recorded. So I think our next logical progression, moving from incarnational theology, then what that means, if that's really true, if we really grasp that has implications, is the next kind of thing that we kind of thought logically was the idea of kind of a temple model of where the people of God have been, where they've come from now, obviously with Jesus being incarnational. As Jesus says, right, not to invalidate the law, but to fulfill it. Yep. But there's still a reordering of how all that goes. And so I'm going to kind of turn things over to Nathan, and he's going to kind of take our discussion there, and we'll maybe leave it on a little bit of a cliffhanger of where we're going.
Yeah, so what we're going to do this today is just kind of unpack the broad brushstrokes of the temple model, really pulling that picture from the Old Testament, and then what it looked like as Jesus shows up, and then further what we'll do then in probably the next episode is unpack exactly how Jesus changed all of that that mindset. So from what we're really pulling this temple model is from some teaching that Andy Stanley has done, in particular his book Irresistible, and because he does a really good job of just unpacking what the temple model looked like for the first century individuals, the Jews there in the first century, and then what Jesus does to change that, but how even moving into modern church time, the temple model in large part is still in place, and what we need to be willing to do to kind of shift away from that. So before going too much further, let's define what the temple model says. He identifies it in four components. He says the temple model consists of these four components. 1, the sacred spaces. 2, the holy texts. 3, the consecrated men. And 4, the genuine followers. And so out of those four, he identifies them and kind of defines them like this. So there have always been the sacred places. And this is not just true of the Jewish religion. This is true largely of world religions across the board. There's always been a place that has said, this is the most, the reference is to Mecca. And so whoever is a part of that religious system, there's always a particular place that is set aside as, well, this is the place where God or the gods kind of interacted with humanity. So there's always the sacred places. The second thing he identifies is always the holy text or the sacred text. That is how God spoke to the individuals who were following. And then the third thing he identifies is you always had the consecrated men. And Andy Stanley does a good job of saying, look, it's always been men. It's always been men who are the consecrated individuals, who are the ones kind of interpreting the holy or sacred text, the ones always identifying the sacred places. And then the fourth piece is that you had the genuine followers, those who agreed with the leaders, the ones who committed their lives to follow the text that was out there saying this is how you should live. And the ones who are always willing to point to the sacred places and say, yep, those are the places, those are the things that, those are the locations where God showed up. And I agree that maybe I'm going to travel there once a year. Maybe I'm going to, I mean, even in our own denominations, when we refer to the sacred places, there are always places within our own denominations, our own movements, say, well, yeah, that's the place. That for me coming out of the Church of God, it was always Anderson, Indiana. That was like Mecca for especially Midwestern Church of Godders, because that was the place that camp meeting always happened. The North American Camp Meeting Convention always took place there, and there were the holy texts, the sacred texts that were always referred to as, well, these are some of the early writings from the Church of God, right? And these are the men and sometimes the women, but largely the men who wrote down the kind of the doctrine of the Church of God, and again, referring to the consecrated men. Now, the Church of God has a long history of engaging and listening to women, but largely it was a lot of men that kind of set the stage and set the tone for the messages of the Church of God. And again, there were women involved in there, but it was a lot of men. and then the genuine followers, some who would always make the trek to Mecca in the summer, which was always a problem because Anderson, Indiana, in early July, one of the most humid, miserable places in the Midwest. And again, there were not that many places, no swimming holes. It wasn't on a lake. So we decided to have camp meeting there in early June. Awful.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of interesting that temple model that was in place when Jesus shows up, and certainly was long before him. And again, I think it's important to recognize this is partly why Jesus says, "I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." And in part, what he's talking about are those things, because the sacred places, those are important.
Well, this is, again, I think, coming back to our incarnational theology, right? I mean, this just proves all the more that is important.
Yeah.
Right? That there are the places, there are the people. I mean, even as a pastor, right, I think, I don't know, there's a particular pastor in our movement that is probably our family's pastor, right? You know what I mean? He's kind of the guy that we look up to. He did my dad's funeral, right? I mean, there's just all these pieces, right?
Yeah.
He was a pastor of a church that we were part of for many years, right? And then the same thing, those places, right? It was the church that my parents got married at, right? That was where Grandpa and Grandma's funeral was at,
Sure.
Or the church that I was married at, right? There's just those. And again, it speaks to the incarnation, right? That the physical is important. But then again, right? So then that next, right? How do we not make sure that we don't get trapped?
Yeah.
In those things, right? In a personality, in a place.
Yeah. Because Jesus, when Jesus shows up, I mean, he begins to not dismantle those things, but return proper perspective to all of those things. And again, when Jesus says, "I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it," I do think he's in part talking about these things, saying, "Look, these things are important, and those sacred places, those holy texts, those men that came before you, and those that were the original true believers." Those things matter.
Yeah.
Because, again, as much as we might identify things that need to change and shift from one generation to another, we have to be willing to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us.
Right.
We cannot throw out everything simply because, well, that model doesn't fit anymore, or that tradition doesn't make sense anymore. Let's acknowledge where we came from. If we're going to make changes and we're going to make shifts in how we do things, let's acknowledge our history. And I think that's in part what Jesus is talking about.
Yep. I'm having a thought right now. I don't know where it fits in, so I'll throw it out and we can see if it fits anywhere. But we were recently just going through the kids. So we homeschool, and part of the curriculum was going through Eli, the priest, and with Hannah, and coming and dedicating Samuel. Right? Do I have that right?
Yeah.
And but there's a part in there, right, where God speaks against Eli because his sons are taking all the best portions of the sacrifices. They're sleeping with all the girls at the, And so it's one of those things too where I think, and again, I don't know where that fits into any of this, but again, those things can be abused.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So whether it's the place or the power, the position, right, as the person.
Well, that's largely what had happened by the first century, right? The temple, which was supposed to be this place where God was meeting with and communing with his people,
got a great racket
became
set up.
this place. Exactly, became this place of the powerful exploiting the poor, and oppressing people. And that's why when Jesus comes into the temple, and what he in that moment when he overthrows those tables and turns the money changers and all that, right? It's this incredibly symbolic moment where he is doing away with this old system that had been corrupted and was broken and was oppressing.
Yep.
And it was meant to symbolize the freedom and the good news, and the that these old systems that were oppressive and are being stripped down.
Sure.
And it isn't that the temple itself was bad; it was how the people were utilizing it. Was. And so Jesus comes and he says, wait a minute, this is not what the temple's for. You're that which God had made for good, you've corrupted, you have used to oppress and marginalized, and that is not my kingdom.
Yeah.
And I think it's in John's gospel again, whether you believe there were two clearings of the temple or only the one, but in John's gospel it does seem to indicate that was earlier in his ministry, but I think it's John's gospel there. He says, then it was at that point they decided to kill him. You know,
Yeah.
well, right? Yeah, you've messed up the gravy train, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Well,
you have.
Yes.
That was in the other Gospels. It's during the week of Jesus' Passion, right?
Yeah,
Because what
that
John
last-
does,
yeah.
John doesn't tell a chronological story. His John is writing a theological gospel,
is,
and so
yes.
he replaces things to construct a theological argument about the divinity of Christ. The other ones, they place it during that Holy Week where yeah, that is when the tides turn, which Jesus had been talking about. He'd been talking about suffering. He even had that conversation about
He
you
was
tear down
already
the
on.
temple.
He was already on the radar.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Right?
No
But
question.
yes, that's when they begin to decide to crucify
Yeah,
him
we
and
got to
kill
do
him.
something about this guy.
Because why? Not because they didn't like what he was teaching, but because he was threatening their power and their authority.
Well, and that's what, and I guess, back to Eli and his sons, I mean, the really scary thing there is, right, God says, look, they're going to die, right? I will make this right. You're not going to like how I'm going to make it right. And so I think the same thing, and again, this is where I think we see that move, right, from that temple model to what I would refer to as like a table model,
Yeah.
But, and so again, I think that's right, then it's, I think all the more incumbent upon us, right, to make sure that we are being honoring, right, that we are being a good stewards of what we've been trusted with. And, but I just, a couple weeks ago, I don't know, we were going through that there at the house, and that just, man, that really stuck out to me. I thought, well, yeah, here's the two guys taking the best portions of the meat
Yeah.
for themselves. They're partying it up with the women, taking advantage of them, and it ultimately leads to their death.
Yeah.
Leads to their destruction. And so, and that's terrible. I hadn't even thought about Jesus'. That's why there's three of us.
Right.
That's why there's three of us.
Right.
That's why. But
I just think it's incredibly important if we are going to, I guess if we're going to address what it looks like for us to be the church, we have to understand where we've come from. That a lot of the systems that are in place, a lot of the expressions of what it means to be a follower are pulled out of the temple model. So as far as we are now removed from the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, we still practice a lot of the temple model stuff because I think in Andy Stanley's book, you hear this. You hear him talk about the sacred places, the holy text, the consecrated men, and the genuine followers. And Jesus comes to kind of disrupt all of that and reset the table on what is of priority. But the thinking can really easily be, wait a minute, aren't we still doing a lot of that stuff? Because, you go to church on a Sunday morning, or you used to be able to go to a church on a Sunday morning, and there is we go to the sacred place. Well, the church. We go to the church building. And standing up front or near the front is someone who is pulling out the Holy Bible, the text.
Yep.
And they're telling everybody else, well, we're telling everybody that might be gathered, this is what the text means. This is how you should interpret it. This is how you should apply it. And you have the genuine followers, the genuine believers who are there going, okay, so we have to be really careful that, because again, some of this is addressing our desire to remain in a comfortable place, because that's been the model for so long. Yep. We go, well, I understand that,
and there's some of it that is good, right?
Sure.
Routine, discipline,
sure.
Schedule, right? All those things. Just if you were to work out physically, right? The same thing. Hey, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, those are gym days. Or so it is that tough thing. Like in our tradition, we do communion every Sunday, and so the same thing. How do you not let that just become a pop and chug, as we call it, that just doesn't become another going through the motions of what you're doing. That you're going, hey, this is really what we're here for, right? To remember that you are bought at a cost, right? It is not your life. It is not your own. I've recently assumed, at least for the time being, our youth ministry roles, and we have a wonderful young lady that has been coming on Sunday nights, and her background is Mormonism, and and we were talking about this just the other night, where they have and I've heard this before, that I think in the Mormon church, they have like 2 or 3 people speak. And I mean, Paul writes that in Corinthians, right? Only 2 or 3 of you should speak, and everybody needs to kind of be quiet, wait their turn, all those things. And so the same thing, I kind of wonder if and C.S. Lewis even writes this too, about having 2 people kind of preach or speak. And so I wonder if we've maybe missed that, if there's an element there where we have relied on just one person to be the interpreter and communicator. And so I think I'm maybe a little envious of your guys' situation, that you have folks that can hear from a couple different voices. And to me, I think it's the strength, I think, too, of doing what we're doing, of having multiple voices and hopefully learning from each other.
Yeah.
So maybe more than just one person. That's the end all be all.
And part of, I think, what we will kind of unpack in the next episode is specifically, coming off of what we just talked about the incarnation of Jesus and what that actually means. So Jesus addresses these 4 things that kind of make up the temple model, and he kind of challenges just how important those things have become for them. And I think it has a lot to speak to us as well. But then what you had talked about very briefly a few minutes ago is the table model. And the table, that it totally changes the dynamic of relationship between in the sacred places and with the holy text and the consecrated men and the genuine followers. That relationship is dynamically changed and adjusted, and what that actually means. Because and again, without tipping the hand too much, when Jesus sits around the table at the Last Supper and he gives them this gigantic piece of theology, he doesn't do it from a place of perceived authority. Now, he has authority in that moment, but it's not him standing up front giving the delivery. Mm-hmm. He's sitting around the table where he's face to face with them, telling them something in a relational context, because that table was extraordinarily relational, because it celebrated their history, and then stuff that we've talked about when it comes to communion. He changes a couple of significant symbols, and again, what he does there is significant.
Yeah.
I mean, if they did not trust him in what he was saying, even if they didn't fully understand it, if they didn't fully trust him, they should have got up from the table and walked out, because he is proposing something completely revolutionary. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't do it from a place of perceived authority. He does it from a place of realistic relationship with them.
Yeah. And these are things that are consistent with his ministry, though, right? Where he says, "Hey, you've heard it said, don't murder." Right. Well, I tell you, right? You've heard it said not to commit adultery, but and so the same thing, right? With this Passover meal, and again, as my understanding is, I've done a few of those, right? Everything on that plate represents, right, something from the history. And so the same thing of taking that bread and that cup and saying, all right, it has a new meaning, right? It has
because they would pause at the different things that were on the table, and they would say, this connects to the old world. This connects to our ancestors. This has meaning. It wasn't just it's down, we pray over it, let's chow. Right. Very different.
Pray for how we plow through.
Yeah.
So, I think back to, boy, if there would have been a time to be alive, I think it would have been very interesting. I forget which gospel has just that one little line in there about, not necessarily about the temple curtain being torn. I think that would have been very interesting to have seen that or been around. But how it said, the graves of other men and women of renown, or I'm trying to think how that's phrased. It's just that one verse there where those graves were open and those people were walking around Jerusalem. Because it wouldn't be one of those things where you'd be like, what is happening?
Yeah.
What the curtain's torn.
It didn't go dark for like 3 hours. Or something.
Well, right. You have, all of those, but just to go, okay, what is shifting here? And I think about, I think it's John 8, maybe it's John 6, the woman at the well, right? Where same thing. That's her. Where do we worship? Right, your people say on this mountain, and my people say on this mountain. And he says, well, woman, I'm telling you, there's coming a day, spirit and truth, right? Worship in spirit and truth. And again, like you said, we fall back in those patterns, maybe not, hopefully not to a detriment, right? Because again, I think some of those things are just natural in what we what we need
Yeah.
as incarnational people.
So it's kind of interesting. You mentioned the temple curtain being torn, the veil being torn.
Yeah.
And this is one of those questions that I have, because the scripture doesn't address it. But when we get to heaven, this is one of the things I want to ask, I want to understand about. And this relates to our desire to return to what is comfortable. So the temple curtain is torn. The veil is torn in two. How quickly did the priest sew it back together and put it back up? How quickly did they go, holy God, what is going on here? We've got to fix this before anybody sees it.
Yeah.
Because they would have, in the Jewish tradition, those guys would have been in trouble.
Yeah.
They would have been in big trouble. And maybe did get in trouble. Again, the scripture doesn't address it, but
that'd be something fun to look into.
Yeah.
You know?
At what point did the priest go, this is just a room now? Like, you can walk into this space and not... Never thought about that.
Yesterday in your message were talking about the temple veil. And I, as you were talking, I was not fully paying attention, and I looked up how big that thing was.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, what
they, if they understand.
I quoted some sizes that I knew wasn't right.
Well, you were on the right track though.
Okay.
So 30 feet wide, 60 feet tall,
I think it was 40
and
or 60.
4 inches or so thick. That is massive.
Yeah.
Well, see, and that's what you just, you didn't use the words cover up or anything, but you go at. I don't even think you're sewing something like that back together.
No, that's probably
right?
true.
You're probably having to get it remade, and so at what point? How do you keep that quiet?
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? Right? I mean, how do you even?
Yeah.
Well, we need.
Okay, don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
This is going to take most of the rest of your life.
And then again, right? I don't think it would take anybody. Right? Again, trying to put yourself in a Jewish mindset. I don't think it would take too many people to go. What does that mean?
Right.
Now that veil is torn. Right. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And
Right.
good stuff.
Yeah. So that's just kind of the primer on where we're headed with this, the next part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just talking about what Jesus comes to redefine with the temple model and the table model. I really like that picture. You've talked about that before, and I've always really gone, that is kind of what replaced or supplanted the temple model. Again, not that it totally shelves it, but it does give some proper perspective and reframes what we're supposed to be doing.
I just think it addresses so much, right? I
Right,
think it
sure
addresses
does.
how we're supposed to do fellowship. I think how we're supposed to do discipleship, how we're supposed to forgive, right? How we're supposed to reconcile. I mean, it's so...
And Jesus models this by who he sits around the table with.
Right.
Yeah. That's right. The betrayer, right? The betrayer has a seat at the table.
Yeah. And partakes.
And yes, yeah. And I was going to say, partakes and is fed.
Yeah.
So,
And only leaves of his own volition. When he's so ridden with guilt, he
yeah.
can't get up. He can't stay.
good stuff.
Yeah.
All right. I think we've had a great day.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Now I need a nap.
Typical preacher thing. We've talked for a couple hours. Now I need a nap. Hey, we hope you've enjoyed this. Again, hit that like button, hit subscribe, all those good things. Share this with your friends, preacher friends, church friends, whatever. Hopefully it's been some good food for thought.